Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this month's edition webinar for the Golden Training Committee. Today's topic will be, today's speaker will be Dr. Esther Freeman. Please, the next slide. So I am Linda Atten from Nigeria. With me will be Dr. Louisa from Brazil. We also have Mekalea from the USA. Just a little introduction of GLODEM, GLODEM Training Committee. GLODEM Training Committee is under the GLODEM International Alliance for Global Health Dermatology. We're the trainee arm of GLODEM, and we promote knowledge equity by improving access to education for dermatology trainees across the world. We also aim to provide free educational events and opportunities to build networks and collaborate. The next slide, please. So just a bit of meeting etiquette. Just so you know, your audio will be muted and camera also will be turned off for the duration of this webinar. If you have any questions, comments, please share via the chat function, and our meeting hosts will share these with the speakers at the end of the webinar. We'll also be sharing some information about the GLODEM Training Committee in the chat function. Next slide, please. Okay, so introducing our speaker, Dr. Esther Freeman. We've actually introduced Dr. Freeman sometime last year during one of our webinars, and we're really glad to have her back again. She's the Director of Global Health Dermatology at the Massachusetts General Hospital. She's also the Director of Clinical Innovation and Education, and also Associate Professor of Dermatology in Harvard Medical School. It's also interesting to know that she's the chair of GLODEM and also the founder of the trainee arm of GLODEM. Dr. Esther, you're welcome, and I'm handing over to her right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda, and I really appreciate that warm introduction. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. And I apologize that I will not be driving my own slides today, but I thank the team here who will be forwarding the slides for me. So really delighted to see all of you, and such an honor to be back. I'm really always inspired by the work of our GLODEM Trainee Committee, and none of these webinars could happen without you or with our wonderful ILDS staff. And so we're so appreciative of just the number of people that you've reached over the last few years. I think just an incredible testament to everyone's hard work. So always a total honor to be back here and with this wonderful group. And I'm so delighted to see trainees from around the world joining us. Next slide. So we will be talking about how to become a peer reviewer, and I'm hoping that this is going to be really practical and take you through why I think peer review is important and how you can become a good peer reviewer. And I'm going to give you a little insight into my overall goal is that all of you are going to take over my job, and that one day I'm not going to be an editor. Instead, all of you will be editors and leaders of dermatology and other publications around the world. And so my goal is to really help you think along that path. And so peer reviewing is actually kind of eventually your way to being an editor. And you might say, I don't think I really want to be an editor. Well, you never know. And I think peer reviewing can strengthen your work in a lot of different ways. So we'll talk about that today. And the real goal is to just make this really approachable and doable, because you absolutely can do this as a trainee. Next slide. So my disclosures is that I am the section editor for the Global Health and Equity section for the British Journal of Dermatology. I'm also co-author for Up to Date in terms of my relevant disclosures for this. So let's talk about why peer review and really why are we giving this seminar? And we're giving this seminar because peer review is something that absolutely you as a trainee can do and can be involved with. And it's really part of the scientific process, and it's used to assess the validity, originality, and quality of articles. And I think it's really important to think about that our research is evaluated by our peers, and that basically people who are experts in that field, and it evaluates the research before it's published. And it really functions as a filter for content. It can really direct better quality and maintain the integrity of scientific literature. Now, I'm going to try, Louisa, for a second. We're going to see if you stop sharing for a moment, I'm going to see if I can share my screen without crashing my computer. If I disappear for 2 minutes, I am sure Louisa and Linda will be able to entertain you, and I promise I will be back. So let me see if I can do this without crashing. So if you stop sharing for a second, Louisa, I am going to try to start. So we're going to give this a try. And this is just a quick 1-minute video that I wanted to share with you guys. So.
At Wiley, we believe in peer review. It's essential not just to publishing, but to the integrity of science. But for new reviewers, the peer review process may feel confusing. So we're taking a closer look at how it works and why we do it. We live in a world where a lot of grand claims get made. Journals only matter because the claims inside them are credible. So everything in a journal has to be vigorously assessed. For authors, peer review can sometimes feel tough. But nearly all agree the comments you get from reviewers help you to improve your work. So, journals seek out experts on a subject from across the world and invite them to review new research. These in-depth reviews mean that editors can make informed choices, and authors can make their work even better. But what about the reviewer? What do they get out of it? Well, a lot of academics will use peer review as a way to give back to their community. Your work will be reviewed by peers, and it feels good to do the same for others. Plus, reviewers get to interact with key people in their field, which can do a great thing for your career. And don't forget, reading the work of others and analysing their work will help you to improve your own writing. Above all though, we review for better science.
Great, thank you. And I should say I have no connections to Wiley. That is a publicly available video. I just thought it does a nice job of kind of introducing you to the concept of why we do peer review. And I'll let Louisa reshare. Thanks, Louisa.
Oh, I think wait. There we go. Can you see it?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you. And you can flip to the next 2 slides, I think. Yep, next slide. Perfect. So I wanted to, you can go back one.
Yeah.
So I wanted to really think through with you what the process is, because I think that unless you're someone who's already published a lot of papers, it may not be clear to you exactly what this process is. So I wanted to break it down and just make it a little bit easier to understand. So the first step is that you do the research and you write the study, and then you'll choose a journal that is most appropriate to submit it to. And there's a lot of different ways to figure out what journal you might be submitting your own research to. So one of them is certainly asking peers or asking colleagues. You can look at journals and see what type of research they've published. And if your research fits, if they've published something similar using similar methods, for example, you can see what types of articles journals are publishing. There are some websites. There's one called JANE, J-A-N-E, which stands for Journal Author Name Estimator, where you can actually put your abstract into a search engine and it will come up with recommended journals. I probably would recommend going first to trusted mentors and peers as your first stop of call, but sometimes if you're really confused, sometimes those websites such as Jane can be helping you at least kind of get a sense of where to submit your research. So say you're an author, you submit your research. It then goes through the process of peer review, the process of revision, and then when it's eventually accepted, then it gets to be published. And there's different ways that this can be published, either open access, which means that you might, as a researcher, may have to pay for it to be published, but you don't, but then the people on the other end don't need to pay for it. Or it can be that it is part of a subscription, so the people on the other end need to pay potentially to access their article or can do an institutional access. And then ultimately the research is out in the world. Next slide. So what can be confusing is how does this actually happen with peer review? And so I realize that this looks confusing. And so if you want to even just close your eyes and not look at it, this is the process we go through, but I'm just going to walk you through a normal paper. So what happens is you submit a paper. The first thing that happens is the editor will read it and look at it. And depending on the journal, this is done different ways. At the British Journal of Dermatology, John Ingram, our editor-in-chief, literally reads every single submission. But that's not necessarily true in all journals. And what will happen is that an editorial office will decide if it needs to be seen by the editor. Once the initial editor assesses it, they'll decide if it's suitable. For example, I'm doing this from the perspective of the British Journal of Dermatology. They'll see if it's suitable for the BJD, and then if it's suitable potentially for review, they'll assign it to a section editor. So here I am in the middle triangle in the middle. The section editor will then decide, okay, do I think this warrants peer review? If they do, they will then potentially send it to an associate editor and assign peer reviewers. If the section editor reads it and says, you know what, this is really not at the level, even with a revision for our journal, they will reject at that point. So you may notice sometimes when you submit your work, sometimes you get a rejection very quickly. That is often what's called a death rejection, which is that an editor pretty early in the process has decided that the article is not appropriate for that journal. If you have a much longer time period, and often you can check in the portal where it says that your paper is under peer review, it means that it's made it through the first set of checks and that one of the editors, usually a section editor, has decided that it is appropriate to send out for peer review. And so once it's sent out for peer review, we wait for the peer reviewers to come back with their reviews. Then the editor will make a decision based on those reviews, and will either reject the manuscript, accept it with either major changes or potentially minor changes. And then ultimately, once those changes are addressed, if the changes are made sufficiently to meet the criteria of the review, the manuscript may finally be accepted. So that's the general process. Next slide. So different types of peer review. Are the most common is probably the single anonymized. And so, for example, here at the British Journal of Dermatology, we follow this process. So what that means is that you as an author will not see my name as a reviewer, but when I'm reviewing a paper, I will see the author names and institutions. So I can see who the author is, but you as an author submitting your work, you'll just see me as reviewer 1 or reviewer 2. You won't see me as Esther Freeman. There is something called double anonymized, where both the reviewers and authors are hidden from each other. And then there's also something called open peer review. And so I should say first, with double anonymized, the idea is that when you submit a paper, I don't even know who you are. I get the paper, but I don't get anything about who or where the authors are coming from. Open peer review is the idea that both the author and the reviewer's identities are open. And I have participated in this myself as a reviewer. And it means that the authors, when they get my review, has my name attached. So they know Esther Freeman, it's not reviewer 1 did this, it's that Esther Freeman actually thought this. So there's certain journals, we at the BJD don't do this, but there's certain journals that have that policy. So that's the general main types of peer review. Next slide. So a lot of it, you might be asking, why would I do a peer review? That sounds like a lot of work. The first thing is that it really keeps you current with the literature. And so you can understand the new trends in publishing, what's coming out in your field, and you have the chance to truly shape the field. Your comments on a paper will change whether that paper is accepted and the shape of the paper itself. It is a service to the scientific community. So I generally, as a commitment myself, will try to review about 1 paper a month. I do more than that because I'm an editor, but in my normal day-to-day life, when I'm not doing my editor duties, I try basically as part of a service to scientific community to try to review about 1 paper a month. And I feel that this is a way that I can give back because there are a lot of people peer reviewing my work. It will also connect you to other people in the field, especially if you write good reviews, people will become aware of you, and it will connect you to authors and editors. And I think one thing that I didn't appreciate at the beginning of my career is that when you are someone who does peer review and does it well, it actually will lead to additional opportunities and can be really great for career development. And one of the ways that this can happen that I think is a little bit unexpected is that you'll actually often get an invitation from the journal to potentially publish a perspective, a commentary, or opinion, often on the article you already did the review of. And I'm going to give you an example of what I mean by this. And this can ultimately lead, for example, to invitations to serve on editorial boards. And my ultimate goal is really to populate the world with all of you being leaders of these editorial boards and increasing our diversity and geographic spread of our editors in dermatology and beyond. So next slide. So I wanted to show you some examples of what has happened in my career because of peer review. This is a very recent example. This just happened in November 2022. So I was asked to review a paper in BMJ, the British Medical Journal, and it was a paper from the United Kingdom, and it was on transmission dynamics of monkeypox. This is before the name was changed to Mpox. And it was a tracing study where they were looking at how monkeypox, now Mpox, was transmitted in the UK. And this was a paper by the UK Health Security Agency. I was requested to be a peer reviewer on this paper, which I did. And after submitting my peer review, the editors of the British Medical Journal reached back out to me and asked me to publish an editorial on this paper that was ultimately released at the same time as the paper itself. So I just wanted to share with you that ultimately I ended up publishing something on Mpox in the BMJ, but purely because I was a peer reviewer of the initial paper. Next slide. And this has happened to me more than once. So this is a paper in The Lancet that was by Susan Crown and colleagues looking at the treatment of AIDS-associated Kaposi sarcoma in resource-limited settings. It was a clinical trial. I was a reviewer of this paper, and they ultimately asked me to write the commentary in The Lancet, which I titled Time to Address Disparities in the Standard of Care for Kaposi Sarcoma. So both of these opportunities for me came out directly out of doing a peer review for these journals. So I just wanted to show you that I think there could be some hidden benefits. Doesn't mean that every time I write a peer review, I get to ask to write an editorial or a commentary, but it's definitely happened to me more than one time. Next slide. So say I contact you from the BJD and I ask you to review a paper for the BJD. What are the practical steps? What do I do now? And this is really the meat of our webinar today, is to talk you through how to handle this. Next slide. So the first thing you need to do is decide if you want to review. So what will happen is we'll send you an email and it will have in it the title of the manuscript, and it will either have the abstract of the manuscript in the body of the email, or you might need to click on a link that will bring you to the abstract. Depends a little bit on the submission system or the journal. We'll also have a deadline. It will say we would like your review back, in 2 weeks or 4 weeks. So the first thing you want to think about is, do you have the knowledge that you might need to review the paper? And do you have the time? If they really want your review and you don't have the time, you need an extra week or two, often the editor will actually grant you an extension. It's really important to be aware that you don't have to be an expert on everything. So when you see a paper, it might be really intimidating to you to say, you know what, I'm not a biostatistician. How am I supposed to review the statistics in this paper? Well, guess what? We asked you because we think that you have expertise in a particular area. Oh, sorry, I'm just going to pause because it sounds like someone's having the slide window. I think actually, to me, it still looks full screen. Maybe someone else can tell us if they're having technical difficulties in seeing the screen, but I can actually see the full screen. So I'll let our wonderful hosts deal with our technical glitch here. Yeah, I think it may be the viewer that's having some issues. Okay, thank you, Emma. So I think to go back to our point is that you really don't need to be an expert in every element. So when I'm asking you to review a paper, I'm asking for your particular expertise. So it may be that the expertise that you have is around the particular geographic region that study is happening in. You might have disease expertise and around that particular disease, or you might have an important perspective. Keep in mind, you're not the only reviewer. We will always have more than one reviewer, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, sometimes more. So point out that don't be intimidated when we ask you to do a review that you need to know everything. You don't. Keep in mind, if it's a really statistics heavy paper, we are going to additionally ask for a statistics review. That doesn't have to be you. So the key is that we want you to comment on the things that you can comment on. If I'm sending Luisa as a reviewer, she is based in Brazil. If I'm sending Luisa a study that's been undertaken, and say it was on leprosy in Brazil. And it has a lot of detailed, methods that are statistics or mathematical modeling. I might be asking her not because she's necessarily a biostatistics expert or a mathematical modeling expert. I might be asking her because I think she's familiar with the context and will be able to comment on the study in the context and what it adds to the literature in her context, right? So keep in mind, we're not asking you to comment on everything. You really have to do it from your point of view. It's also important to think about conflict of interest. And if you can't do it, what we really appreciate as editors is there's a little decline box that says, I can't do it. Rather than just ignoring the email, let us know that you can't do it. You hit the decline button. And if you have an idea of someone who you think would actually be better at it or has the appropriate expertise, then we ask that you suggest that person. You can just give us a name or ideally an email of the person. That's very, very helpful. Next slide. So this is what it will look like. The British Journal of Dermatology has recently migrated to Oxford University Press, and there's a system called Scholar One. And basically what will happen is you'll log in, it will hit accept, I am willing to review it, and then it will give you the option to download the PDF. It's pretty self-explanatory, but once you have the PDF, that's what will allow you to view the full paper. Usually you won't be able to view the full paper until you've decided to review it. So usually you'll just get an abstract and a title. And then once you've decided to review, you'll get the full PDF. Next slide. So what the editors expect you to come back with peer review is to have to look at specifically for the journal guidelines. And what I'm going to give you are general guidelines on how to write a review today. You are ultimately going to be asked to make some sort of recommendation for publication, but keep in mind, you're not making the final decision. You are basically giving them your opinion, and they're going to be collecting opinions from multiple different reviewers, right? So if you say reject or accept, they're not necessarily they're going to take that into account, but keep in mind, it's multiple opinions that are going into that. And we also it's important to be professional and courteous. So always being polite. There's no reason to kind of make people feel bad about their papers that they've submitted to you. So really highlighting always some positive things. Keep in mind, often you might be the person on the receiving end of these reviews, and having a really kind and professional review is really helpful rather than something that's hurtful or personally attacking. And then I think ultimately maintaining confidentiality is really important. So you may see a paper that is in your area or in your field, and if that is not published, you cannot share that with other people. So this is truly a confidential process. Next slide. All right, so here's the big moment. You looked at this paper and you said, yep, I have time to review it, and I'm going to accept this challenge. Where do I start? And I want to take you through a step-by-step process to make this a little bit easier. All right, so here are the steps that I recommend that you go through. The first read is to go through, sorry, I'm just seeing some Q&A, and I'll get back to that, Bridget's question in a second. So the first step is that I do a first read. And this is really just to skim read the whole article and get the general gist. Is this within the scope of the journal? Do you kind of generally understand what's going on? Don't try to write detailed notes the first time you read it. My real recommendation is read the whole article through and just get a general sense of what's going on before you start taking any notes. Then you go through the second read, and this is your more in-depth read of the content. So you're going to look at the full manuscript and you're going to specifically take it section by section, and I'll take you through that. And here's where you're going to write your specific relevance, comments, and notes. And you're going to go through any major and minor flaws with each section. Then you might do a nice third read where you're looking at some other details around, writing skills, language, if there's some way that you would recommend rephrasing some things, and minor flaws. And then finally, you're going to summarize the review section by section. It's really helpful to our reviewers and to our authors and our editors if you actually number your comments, because it's much easier as an author if you're responding, you say, this is a response to reviewer 2, comment number 5. It's much easier to respond that way. Next slide. So examples of major flaws that you'll be looking for would be things like conclusions that aren't really supported by the evidence that they present in the study. If the data is unclear or contradictory, or if, for example, they did a study, but they didn't really acknowledge the prior processes or areas that were previously done before that are relevant to that study. Certainly things like plagiarism, ethical concerns, always there, but also, do your methods support your goal? Do they make sense? And the way you conducted your data analysis, is that also systematic and make sense? Things that are minor flaws that wouldn't necessarily really sink a paper, but you'd want corrected, would be things like citations that have issues, or whether tables or figures were, needed some editing, things like sentences that you need to update the way that they're written just for clarity purposes. So these are things that are relatively more minor. Next slide. So let's talk about the meat of this. You've agreed to review. You know that you're going to run all the way through once. You're then going to go to your second read, and you're going to critically examine each section of the manuscript. So let's talk about how you do that. Next slide. So first section is going to be the introduction. And you don't have to do this, by the way, in order. You can do this in whatever order you want. I'm going to start with the general order of the paper, but if you want to read it through and you want to critique the method section first, that's absolutely fine. So you start with the introduction in this example. You're going to see, does the introduction meet these criteria? Does it clearly describe the research question and the aims? Does it clearly summarize what is already known about the topic, so it doesn't brush past prior existing literature? Does it really explain the gap that they're addressing and say how this is relevant and new, what it will be adding? And does it explain to you why the research was carried out and what the objectives of the study are? Next section. So next, you would review the materials and methods, also known as methodology. So did they use the appropriate study design? Is this replicable? And we put little buttons over here to explain what we mean by replicable, repeatable, and reliable. So replicable is that if somebody else did the study, would they find the same results? Repeatable is there enough information that someone could do a similar study? And reliable is there enough detail that you can actually ensure the reliability of the study? So things that you're going to ask yourself is, if these study methods are appropriate, valid, reliable, they define and measure the variables appropriately, and are the study methods replicable? Next slide. Then we get into the results and the discussion. So things that I want you to consider when you're looking at someone's results is, are the findings that are reported really clear and coherent? And are the figures and tables, do they support the results section, and are they appropriately written? The discussion, and this is often where people have a lot of comments, is how does it explain the significance of the results? Do they put it in context of the existing research? And do they explain their limitations of the study? Next slide. And thinking about the conclusion, or really the end of the discussion section, is you want to think about, did the aims of the study that they set out in the introduction, were they achieved? Were they supported by the results? And so really the key often here is, sometimes the conclusion authors will claim larger things that are truly supported by the results. So did what they say in the conclusion, was it really supported by the data that they presented? Next slide. All right, so I wanted to give you a concrete example of how to do it, because it's all well and good to hear about the process and how you would approach each section, but it's quite another thing to see it actually in action. And I'm indebted to Dr. Sidra Khan and this entire team of co-authors, many of whom are key members of the GloDerm Trainee Committee, for being willing to share one of their papers. This paper has been published. It's called A Skin Disease Survey of the Maasai in Northeastern Tanzania. It was published in 2022 in the British Journal of Dermatology. What I particularly want to appreciate our co-authors for here, and I should say co-authors, I'm not an author on this study, but the co-authors that wrote this study, is that they were willing to share a little bit of their process of getting to the final version. And that's what I'm going to share with you today. So again, I thank them specifically for letting us share this process with you. And this is done specifically with their permission. So I'm going to kind of skim read this with you, because I know that many of you have not read this study. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how to go through the process. So this is a research letter. So a research letter is not a full-length paper. In the British Journal of Dermatology, a research letter is 750 words, whereas standard, a original manuscript, depending on the journal, will usually be anywhere from 2,500 words, which is 2,500, to 3,000 words. So a research letter is going to be shorter, usually somewhere around 750, 500, depends on the journal. For the BJD, it's 750. So it's still going to have original research, but it will be much shorter, and you don't necessarily see the sections written out. So if you were in an original article, it would say background or introduction, and then it would specifically have a header that said results, right? Or methods, and then results, and then discussion. Now with a research letter, they don't have those sections. The sections are still there, they're just not labeled as such. So I'll show you what I mean. So this is a research letter done by Dr. Khan and colleagues. So what they talked about is the background. They said there's a scarcity of dermatologists across most of the African continent, and there's a lack of dermatology training programs. This, combined with a paucity of skin health data from the region, ultimately impacts healthcare planning needs and dermatologic care for the population. That's their general background. Then they talk about the specifics. The population of Tanzania is estimated to be 59 million, with approximately 125 ethnic groups. Many live in remote and rural communities. A skin cancer, and this is, by the way, the first draft that they submitted, not exactly the final version, as you'll see. A skin cancer screening survey of Chapwa village, southern Tanzania, found high rates of skin disease, around 34%, the majority of which were fungal. Another study that surveyed 2 villages in Ngara district in northwestern Tanzania found communicable skin disease to be the most common dermatoses seen. And then they note that psoriasis was uncommon. Another group that resides predominantly in rural and remote settings in northeastern Tanzania is the Maasai. They are known for their nomadic pastoralist way of life. And then they talk about the complex relationship between human-livestock interface and zoonotic infections. Many Maasai often use herbal medications prior to or instead of attending healthcare facilities, posing challenges for healthcare work providers, as noted by our co-authors. There remains a scarcity of health data in the Maasai in general, and to the best of our knowledge, no data on skin in the published literature. And here they state their objective. We therefore set out to conduct a skin disease survey of Maasai adults to better understand the dermatologic needs. Then they talk about the specific study. In July 2019, an outreach dermatology clinic was established and run by members of the Global Psoriasis Atlas and staff from the RDTC in Moshi, Tanzania. They talk a little bit about the GPA being a long-term project, and then they talk about their ethical approval. The population was sensitized to the outreach clinic beforehand through notifications from local mosques, churches, and markets. And then they talk about data collection, including information on age, gender, number of individuals per household, diagnoses, and previous treatments. Data were also gathered on the impact of skin disease on daily living, social, and work life. Now, I want you to think to yourself, and we'll do this in a second, I want you to think to yourself which paragraph belongs to what section. So they are correct in that they don't have section headers here because this happens to be a research letter, but you can still see that each paragraph generally corresponds to a particular section of the manuscript. Next slide. So the second half of this study looks at their results. So they had 51 adults with skin disease who attended the outreach clinic and met their exclusion criteria. And you see some of the results there. Clinical diagnoses were based on the International Classification of Diseases 11th revision, and they talk about infections of the skin, particularly fungal, being the most common, and then dermatitis and eczema. More than half the patients had sought previous treatment for their skin disease, and most of them have received topical therapies. And of those who did not seek prior treatment, they said it was due to distance. And then it goes into some more detail about people reporting skin disease affecting their daily life. And then it talks at the end of that paragraph, it says limitations of this study include small sample size and lack of validated quality of life measurement tools. In summary, the most common dermatoses seen among the Maasai adults were fungal skin infections followed by dermatitis and eczema. This is in keeping with skin disease surveys of other rural populations in Tanzania. Of relevance to the Global Psoriasis Atlas was partly the confirmation of the rarity in Tanzania previously demonstrated by other studies. We also demonstrate that skin disease does impact the work and social lives of the Maasai traveling distance is a barrier to seek treatment. However, more work is required to better understand quantify the burden of skin disease in Tanzania, including the use of validated tools and point prevalence study. All right, and then you can skip through the next couple of slides that I think are showing their tables. So you can skip this one. Yep, so these are just showing you their references and their tables. Next slide. So what we've done is to split up the manuscript into sections. So even though, as I said, research letter, it's not totally clear which is which section, you can see that the first 3 paragraphs are really talking about the introduction. So what you want to be thinking about when you're looking at the introduction was, does it clearly describe the research question or aims? That's the first question. And I would say that probably yes. If you look at that last sentence of the 3rd paragraph where it says, we therefore set out to conduct a skin disease survey of Maasai adults to better understand their dermatologic needs. They pretty clearly state what their research question is. Do they clearly summarize what is already known about the topic? And that's really in that 2nd paragraph. Do you see how they're talking about the population of Tanzania, and then they talk about prior skin screening in the Chapwa village in southern Tanzania, and they also talk about 2 different villages in the Ngara district, right? So they give you some good background. Does it establish the originality of research by highlighting the need for investigations in this topic area? So I think that they do talk about a gap, right? So what they're saying is that if you look at the 2nd to last sentence on this page where it says, there remains a scarcity of health data of the Maasai in general, and to the best of our knowledge, no data on skin disease in the published literature. So I'd argue, I think they do a pretty good job laying out why the research was carried out and what the gaps are. Okay, so that's really kind of one of the first pieces that you want to think through. So I think they actually did a pretty good job with laying that out. And we're going to move on to the next slide. So that's the introduction. So I don't have a lot of comments really on that one, but you would see how you go through those different questions. So next, let's look about their methods. So you want to think about if they used appropriate study design, and are they replicable? Do they provide enough detail? This is a little hard in a research letter, right? Because the methods here are very short. It's just 1 paragraph. Now, it happens to be that the Global Psoriasis Atlas is a project that has really been very well published. And you can see that they have a citation here, citation number 7, where it says the GPA is a long-term project that strives to develop a better understanding of psoriasis globally. So they're able to get away with not giving us a lot of detail because it's already been published. And so we can see the survey instrument somewhere else. If this was the only time the survey was being used, I would say that there's probably insufficient information here about how you would repeat the study and how replicable it is. Because if you look at the information on data collection, it's pretty limited. It's basically 2 sentences. They say the last 2 sentences here. Data collection include information on age, gender, number of individuals, dermatologic diagnoses, and treatments. Data was also gathered on the impact of skin disease on daily living, social, and work life. So they don't really tell us how they measured any of these. And so if I were reading this and we didn't know that this was already relatively well published elsewhere from this Global Psoriasis Atlas project, one of my comments would be that I think it would be very hard for me to know what scales they used and how they collected their data. And one way you can get around this in a research letter when it's very short is to, for example, include some of this stuff as supplemental material. So you might not have words to include it in your main manuscript, but I might want to see it in a supplement where I could then go and see how they measured things like daily living, social, and work life. So I think that's here they've kind of gotten away with it a little bit because they were able to cite an existing resource that you could then would go and have a lot more information. But I think otherwise this would be a little bit short and hard to, if they didn't have that, it would be a little hard to figure out exactly how they had done their methodology. Next slide. So then in terms of the results, so here I've pulled out specifically the results section. And so I want you to think about if the findings are clear and coherent. Did they present data in a clear way? And here's where you're really going to dig into the figures and tables. In this review today, and I would encourage you to see the final published version, by the way, of this excellent paper. And we're picking it apart because these wonderful authors have allowed us to do that. It did get published and it's a wonderful paper. So I encourage you to look at the final version and you can take a look at their tables. Just for speed reasons, we're not going to go through the tables as part of our review today, but you would really be looking at the tables and carefully and closely during your review. So you want to think about if these are clear and coherent and do they present it in a clear way. I would say overall, this paper, I think, does a pretty good job. They talk about how they diagnose things on the International Classification of Disease Revisions. They talk about the different skin diseases. They give us both an N and a %. There are not any statistical comparisons that they're presenting in this research letter, so they're not really doing any statistical tests. This is really purely a descriptive study. And I think that you could argue that some of the wording maybe could use a little bit of rewriting or making it clear. I think that other pieces that you might ask for would be, for example, if you look at the third paragraph down. So it says, the third paragraph down says, of those that did not seek prior treatment, 59% stated this was due to distance. And I might say I'm a little unclear about what that means. And for the other thing you might say is, well, if 59% said they didn't seek treatment due to distance, well, what about the other 41%? Right? So there's lots of people that didn't seek treatment, the other 41%. Why did they not seek prior treatment? Right? What is the manuscript not telling you? So as a reviewer, you might ask for some additional details here. Next slide. So now let's think about the discussion and the conclusion. And I kind of view these all together, right? And so the way that their paragraphs were, some of their discussion section kind of blended into a prior paragraph, which is why the spacing looks a little bit funky there. But you can see that they did go through the limitations, right? They mentioned the sample size and the lack of validated quality of life measurement tools. So that's an important, if you see that's our third checkbox under the discussion section, is how you think about the limitations to the study. And I think you also want to think about the significance as it relates to wider understanding and other results. And does it really fit in with context? And I think here we could probably pick apart that maybe they could add some additional context. So they did say that skin disease does not impact the work and social lives of the Maasai, but that traveling, does impact. I said the opposite, excuse me. Skin disease does impact the work and social lives of the Maasai, and traveling distance is a barrier. And it talks about how we need to understand better and quantify the burden of skin disease in Tanzania, particularly in other groups. Now, what it doesn't say is how does this relate to the region in general, and what are the implications potentially for other populations of this study, right? So you could argue that maybe we need to think about the context of this and how the significance of these results relate to a wider understanding. And I'm going to show you how the authors responded to that critique. So I think that the conclusion does indeed reflect the aim of the study and support the results. And it's maybe a little vague about providing directions for future research. So let's see how the authors responded to these critiques. Next slide. So in the results section, there was some rewording, which I've highlighted here in yellow. And thank you to my medical student research fellows for this presentation and for their work on these slides for me. I'll mention them at the end. So we've highlighted here in yellow where they've changed just some of the wording for clarity purposes. And you can see where they're suggesting you go to table 1 for a list of full clinical diagnoses. What you can see with the green arrow is where they added detail. So one of the critiques of this paper is that 59% stated they didn't come to the clinic because of distance. And so they added some additional detail in response to the review. So they said they added, most of the patients stated that this was due to distance required to travel, followed by time associated with seeking treatment, and then subsequently embarrassment about their skin disease. So you can point out that this actually adds a lot of richness to the paper, right? This was not originally in the paper, and it allows us to really add some depth to our understanding of why people may not come in to seek care. Next slide. So in the discussion, we had mentioned that there was maybe a little bit more needed to happen in terms of putting these results in the overall context. So one thing that they added was about the issue of dermatitis as producing one of the major burdens of disease in this population. So they added in kind of in the discussion section a little bit more of an opinion statement, which is that this is unsurprising as dermatitis is reported as producing the greatest burden of skin disease in sub-Saharan Africa. So they've now taken their study and put it in the overall context of the region. The other thing that they added, and you can see in their summary paragraph, was we wanted to think a little bit more again about how their results fit into the global context. So they've added this additional sentence. The study highlights the need for fieldwork in certain communities to better understand their specific dermatologic needs and avoid the potential pitfalls of extrapolating data from studies elsewhere in the region. And I think the second half of the sentence is really important to say, avoid the potential pitfalls of extrapolating data from elsewhere in the region. And the idea being that each particular community and study will have a slightly different burden of disease, and that it's sometimes tempting to say, data from Tanzania represents all of Tanzania, whereas it clearly doesn't, right? So I think the second half of the sentence was a really key informational piece that they added. So I hope that that discussion of a specific paper has helped understand a little bit how I would approach going through different papers. I will point out that this is a very good paper that did not require a lot of necessarily changes or editing, but I wanted to take you through a research letter so you could kind of see the process. I encourage you to take a look at their final version, and you can go to the next slide. Which was published, actually you can skip through. This is just the final draft, which you can now see online, and you can skip through all of these. This is how and so this is the final published version, which is available in the BJD. I encourage you to read it. As I said, I'm not an author of this, but I really do appreciate the authors allowing us to go through in detail their study, just to think about how they changed over time. And so you can take a look at the final published version and see how they've incorporated those changes. Next slide. So what does a good review, now that I've taken you through the process of going section by section, what does a good review look like? And what does a not so great review look like? Next slide. So a good review, and this is from a paper that's available. So this is not a good review on a derm paper. This is just a good review from a different topic. So if you read this and you say this doesn't sound like dermatology, you're correct. This is about sternal wires to reduce the incidence of mediastinitis. I would have to go back and think in my own medical school training what that even means, right? So I'm showing this to you not because of the topic, but I'm showing this to you because it's an example of how to structure a review. And this is available from the Journal of Interactive Cardiovascular and Thoracic Surgery. And so this is just a nice paper on how to complete a review. So the first sentence of the review, very polite, professional. Thank you for asking me to review this paper entitled, and here's the title of the paper. So then the next paragraph that the reviewer, so this is this is not the paper itself, this is what a reviewer wrote. They first summarize what the paper was doing. This is a paper that reviews the last 7 years of cardiac surgical operations at their institution, and then it talks about what their conclusion is. The next thing, and this is obviously a little wordy, some of them are not as long as this, but this is really a very good review. They then summarize some of the strengths. They touch on the originality of their research and the importance of their research question. So they say, well, there are many papers on this subject, and they missed one particular review, and papers of different types of wire. Potentially, this might make a good paper due to its large size and the way in which the two groups are nicely balanced, right? So they're giving you the pros. Next slide. The next thing that a good review will do will have labeled individual numbered comments. And again, this is a pretty wordy review. There's you don't have to write super long sentences like this, but it clearly goes piece by piece. So it starts with the methods. It might, in fact, start with the introduction, and then it would go to the methods, and it gives people an individual one by one labeled comment number. So if you are the author and you get this, you'll see, okay, reviewer number 1, comment number 2. I can now easily respond to them because they're numbered. It provides constructive feedback and is really professional, right? There's nothing about they did a terrible job or I don't like what they did. It was very specific and constructive. So, for example, in the first comment, it says, why did they choose 7 years rather than a longer period? This wasn't mentioned. So giving really concrete ways and things they can respond to. Next slide. And they go through the same way that we talked about. They go through the presentation results. They go through the validity of the study. And this is for the results section. Next slide. And then they go through the discussion. And often I will say this particular review really focused on the results. I will say often people have a lot to say around the discussion, and in particular, this area around whether the conclusions are supported by the data. And then ultimately, this reviewer did have a recommendation for publication. Often in the review, this will be a separate box. So you'll write the review without writing your recommendation for publication in the text of the Word document itself, but then you will click off a button that says whether you recommend accepting with major revisions, minor revisions, or rejecting the paper. So this in detail is available we've adapted it slightly, but it's available from How to Complete a Review in the European Journal of Cardiothoracic Surgery, in case you would like to review it again. Next slide. So I think in contrast, what a poor review would look like is this. So you would get the whole review would be 2 lines, and you've probably seen this on your papers. It says, this is a paper on additional sternal wires for protecting against mediastinitis. This is nicely done, and I recommend it for publication. As an editor, this review is basically useless to me. I don't know what it is that you liked about it. It's nicely done, but there's no constructive feedback. There's no structure, and there's no detail. So if you send me a review like this, I basically can't use it, and I have to ask somebody else to do a review. So really try to provide constructive details about why you liked something, and really try to go section by section. Next slide. So we're going to do a quick knowledge check. And so this is our poll to see how it went in terms of our presentation, if you kind of were able to pick up on some of our clues. So the first question I'm going to ask, and we're going to do this as a poll, is what characteristics do editors value in peer review? Ability to communicate clearly, reliability to stick to deadlines, ability to provide constructive feedback, ability to maintain confidentiality, or all of the above. And Emma, can you let me know if the poll is working? I don't see it on my end, but that doesn't mean that they're not seeing it. Oh, good. All right. Good. I'm just giving everyone a chance to answer. Numbers going up. All right, I'll end the poll. You guys are very good. So indeed, the answer is all of the above. And indeed, so basically all of these aspects are a really important part of peer review, including, as we talked about, the ability to maintain confidentiality. All right, next, sorry. And then we go on to our next slide. And if you can switch to question 2. On the slide, Louise, I can thank you. Perfect. Okay. In what situation may a peer reviewer have to declare a potential conflict of interest? We didn't actually talk about this, what constitutes a conflict of interest. So shooting from the hip here. 1, if they've recently published on the same topic. 2, they've recently met the authors. 3, they are affiliated with the same institution as one of the authors. D, they attended the same medical school as one of the authors. Or E, they're in the same country as one of the authors. I'm going to give everyone some time to answer. Good. So we have 1932 people participating, and most folks felt, let me share results here, that being affiliated with the same institution as one of the authors would be a potential conflict of interest you would need to declare. And that actually is correct. 55% felt that. So you do need to declare this as a potential conflict of interest if you are at the same institution. It may turn out that you are still able to review the paper, depending, the editor will review that, but you do need to declare that so it's clear that you are affiliated with the same institution. The same would be true if you directly work with someone. So if you have a work collaboration, but you're not at the same institution, you do need to declare it. So if someone is a research collaborator with you, you work directly with them, even if they're not at the same institution, you would need to share that. Now, interestingly, recently publishing on the same topic actually just makes you a better reviewer because you are aware. Now, if this person was in you felt direct competition with you, and this was going to be a problem for you being able to do a fair review, then you certainly could declare it as a conflict of interest, but it's not actually a conflict of interest if you've recently published on the same topic. It just makes you potentially better prepared. Even if you've recently met the authors, it's completely fine. That's not a conflict of interest. It's only if you are working directly with them. Would that be a problem? Next slide. And so for question number 3, which is the peer review process ensures that, number 1, or A, all research is published. B, published research is valid, original, and of high quality. Authors are recognized for their work. Articles are assigned to the correct journals, and editors are recognized for their work. So this one's a little bit more straightforward, and most of you felt indeed that it was that published research is valid, original, and of high quality. And then our last knowledge check here. So I don't mind advancing the slide to question 4. So when making the decision to peer review, one must consider if they are familiar with all the statistical methods in the article, if they are amicable or friends with the authors of the manuscript, if they have adequate time to complete a thorough review, if they agree with the study design, and if all the research aims are valid. So if you yourself are going to decide if you're going to participate in the peer review process, what do you need to think about yourself? Right, so we have over half of people participating here, about 62%. So most of you felt that having adequate time to complete a thorough review is important in your own decision to accept that review. That is absolutely correct. Let's talk about some of the other ones. So some folks picked that if they're familiar with all the statistical methods in the article. So the key here is the word all. What I want to highlight is you don't have to be an expert in everything in order to accept a peer review. And it's completely fine to say, I am not an expert in logistic regression, or I am not an expert in mathematical modeling, or whatever review the authors used. But you can still comment on the pieces that you can comment about. So you don't necessarily need to be an expert in all of the statistical methods that they use. It's okay to be able to just say what your strengths are, what your expertise is, and comment on that piece of it. The next question is about if the research aims are valid. So you're going to be reviewing if the research aims are valid, but you don't actually have to know that in advance of accepting the paper, because we're asking you if the research aims are valid as part of your review. But that actually doesn't have to be a prerequisite. You can review a paper and you might say the research aims are completely not valid, but that still means you're still able to review it. So I think I just wanted to highlight that piece of it. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not sure if I shared those results with you. Perfect. All right. And if you don't mind just passing forward, I wanted to just say a couple more slides. Thanks, Louisa. There are reviewer resources out there, and I'll talk with the GTC about how we can potentially post this on the Glowderm website, because I think these are really helpful thinking about different guidelines for peer reviewers. So we will try to post these resources for you so they're more easily accessible. Next slide. And just to remind you, if you are not part of our website and part of our mailing list, the upper right-hand corner on glowderm.org, the Join Our Mailing List button. I suspect if you're here, you're already on the mailing list, but just to remind you. Next slide. And I wanted to also say to this group that the Glowderm Mentorship Program for our leadership program, which is our Changemaker program to become a mentee, we've just extended the deadline from early February to February 28th. We did send just a reminder last night about this, that we have extended the deadline. I would strongly encourage you to apply. It is a competitive program, so if you don't get it the first year, don't panic, please do reapply. We're going to be taking 10 mentees this year, and applicants should be from low and middle income countries, with the small exceptions that if you're working, for example, with a native population in a higher income country, that can be an exception. There is a really exciting opportunity for our 10 new mentees to be going to the World Congress in Singapore. And there'll potentially also be an opportunity to spend a 2-week placement with your mentor. So really exciting opportunity. And we just wanted to let you know that the deadline has been extended to February 28th. Next slide. And I want to say a huge thanks in particular to medical student Morva Reed Zaitab, who put together many of these slides with me. And I'm so appreciative of all of my research fellows, Janet Lubov and Alexis Strahan, and in particular to the GloDerm Trainee Committee. Next slide. If you need to find me, you can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Esther Freeman. Next slide. And thank you for listening and participating. I know we're a little bit over time, but I'll stick around to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Freeman, for this wonderful session. So I'll hand over to Louisa for questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we have one question from Bridget Polkran. She asks, what website do you sign up to become a peer reviewer, to receive emails and to be able to review an article? And what is the initial process on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so different journals handle this in different ways. For the British Journal of Dermatology, we actually don't have a particular sign-up form. We often end up choosing reviewers who have published articles in the BJD or who are known to us. That being said, if you are interested in being listed in the BJD, and we do have a new category specifically for global health, and also for expertise in things like structural racism. If you are interested in being listed as a reviewer, please feel free to email me and we can actually add you to the system. I'm going to put my work email in here for a minute. So I'm going to put this in the chat, which is efreeman@mgh.harvard.edu. Feel free to email me. You can also email the general BJD address, and we can actually add you on our end into the editorial system. And in particular, what we'll do is there's a checkbox for adding you on underneath global health. Some other journals, so I think for the JAD, and I can't remember off the top of my head, but so for some other dermatology journals, there is a way for you to externally just sign up. But often the way that you get sent a review is if you have published in that area, if you have known expertise. But that's why I'm really reaching out to this group, and I would encourage you to reach out to me if you would like to be listed as a reviewer, because it's my very not secret goal to increase the diversity of our reviewer pool and to include our trainees in review, because I think even though you might feel, gosh, I'm still a trainee, maybe I don't have the expertise to do this, the reality is you do. You have a lot of expertise in your particular area. And so I really want to make it, more approachable for you to be part of the peer review process.
Yeah, and I have a little question. I don't know if we still have time, but
Yeah,
shouldn't like all the peer reviews be double blinded? Because I mean, when you read the name of the author and you know him, or I don't know, it's just for me, it creates like bias even without you wanting it.
It's such a great, Louisa, it's such a great question without, I would say, a totally straightforward answer. And the reason being is that there are times when you need to understand the context of who the authors are or where the authors are writing from is actually a key part of reviewing the article. But not always, right? So, not always. And so I think it is really tricky. I have participated in different types of review. Sometimes for example, for conferences, they'll do blinded peer review for conference abstracts where you aren't given the authors or their affiliations. I actually think that's very helpful to contribute to the blinded process. I am going to give you one example where I think it may be important to know who the authors are. And I think there's pros and cons, right? So in the British Journal of Dermatology, we are soon going to be launching for the global section on global health and equity. For my section, we're going to be launching something called an authorship reflexivity statement. It's not live yet, so I'm giving you guys a little preview, but the authorship reflexivity statement is something that's been published in Global Health recently, in PLOS Global Health, really as a challenge to journals and journal editors to have really think about who the authors are. So are these, for example, people from the global north who are traditionally white, who are writing about issues in the global south without actually being part of that community? And if you don't know who the authors are, it's actually very hard to judge that. Now, I think the point of the authorship reflexivity statement is to go one step beyond and say, you as an editor cannot look at my name and my institution and tell me if I'm actually, part of this community, or what has the research done to impact that community? Has it done anything for capacity building or anything like that, right? I can't tell from your name. The authorship reflexivity statement that we're going to be requiring would actually have the authors reflect on who they are and how that's contributed to their work. So I think we're the first derm journal that I know of that will be adding this to our submission portal. It's not live yet, so I'm probably going to get in trouble from the BJD of telling you guys it's live, but it's coming. It's coming. And
no one will say anything.
Yes, nothing will say it on the web, but it's coming soon, and I think it's a really important change. So Louisa, I think I have two answers. One is I agree with you that there's this level of potential impartiality where you don't know, this is a really influential author, therefore I'm going to automatically assume it's a good paper, right? There's some bias there.
Yeah.
But then there's also, particularly in global health, this idea that who you are and where you're situated in comparison to what you're writing about is also relevant. So I don't have like a yes or no answer for you.
Yeah, it's hard. Yeah, we're humans, right? Sometimes we have to. We cannot be perfect, we're not robots. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. So I think we're 10 minutes ahead of our time. So thank you very much, Dr. Freeman. I think I loved it personally. I think it was a subject that we're not really, we don't have much lectures on, and it was really helpful. So thank you very much for your availability and all your help. Thank you everyone who participated. You are more than welcome to join us in our next webinars. We'll have at least one a month throughout our academic year in 2023. And thank you all. Bye-bye. It was amazing.
And we'll upload it to YouTube, so you can watch it again. When you're actually reviewing a paper, it's going to be more helpful to sit there and go through section by section, right? It's all good, well, good to hear it, but it's when you get your first review, then you can pull me up and you'd be like, oh yeah, these are the questions I'm supposed to ask myself.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, it will be recorded. Thank you guys. Bye-bye.